Welcome, everybody. My name is Jan Růžička, and I have the privilege of hosting and chairing the discussion today on the COVID crisis and international politics. The event is hosted by the Center for Philosophy, Ethics and Religion at Charles University in Prague. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Jakub Jirsa, who is one of the vice presidents of the center and also, I believe, the spiritus agens of the whole enterprise for the invitation to myself and my friends and colleagues who are joining in the discussion. Firstly, I should like to welcome Professor Ken Booth, who is a distinguished research professor in the Department of International Politics at Aberystwyth University in the United Kingdom. That means he is a senior colleague of mine. And really, he's a legend in the field of international relations and international politics, fellow of the British Academy, former E.H. Carr professor in the department, the very first one, and holder of numerous awards. I think among these, most notably, the Susan Strange Award of the International Studies Association. Hello, Ken.
Hi, Jan.
The next person I should like to introduce is Professor Richard Beardsworth, who is Professor of International Politics and Head of School of Politics and International Studies at the University of Leeds. Richard used to be a colleague of mine once upon a time, and he also briefly held the E.H. Carr chair, which makes him a Ken's follower of sorts. But besides that, he also had positions at the American University in Paris, Florida International University, and is a very important voice in the field writing on state responsibilities and cosmopolitanism. The next person I would like to introduce is Benoit Pelopidas, who is a professor of international politics, and he's joining us from Paris, I believe, Benoit.
I'm hiding in the countryside now, but people won't be able to say that this is not Paris.
He is professor at SciencesPo in Paris, and he's director of the Nuclear Knowledges program there that he founded. And I think it's not only one of the truly groundbreaking centers in Europe on nuclear research, but as I think he likes to stress, and I should like to stress too, an independent research center, which is quite unique in the French context. And he's one of the world's leading experts on nuclear weapons and things connected to that. Now, he's characteristically modest, which is why he's making the face, but I think that's fair to say. And also joining us is Sanne Verschuren, who's a doctoral candidate at Brown University in Rhode Island in the United States. Brown is a very nicely located place, for those of you who don't know it, overlooking the ocean. So I'm slightly envious. And Sanne is also a pre-doctoral fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard. And most importantly, in the current context, she is a co-author of an article that I had the privilege of reading a little while ago with Benoit, and I think we'll have excellent insights as well. My name, as I said, is Jan Růžička, and I am working at Aberystwyth University, and I'm also director of the David Davis Memorial Institute. Our topic is on COVID and international politics, and perhaps it would give our listeners a better view of who you are if I ask you, as a matter of introduction, how you think very briefly what we've witnessed in the last year or so, how it relates to some of the key themes in your work. And so if I could invite you, I mean, I think there are distinct themes in all of your scholarly work where COVID or the COVID-induced crisis will fit nicely in some ways, but you might be the best people to actually say where you think it really fits with your work. And so one of the things that Ken wrote about and has been peddling for about 20 years now, or less than that, but which features prominently in what he claims is his best book, The Theory of World Security, is the notion of what he calls the Great Reckoning. And Great Reckoning is an idea that the institutions that we've seen serving humanity for the last, 500 years or so, Ken, no longer work. And so I ask you, Ken, as a way of introduction to yourself and your writings, how does the current crisis fit with the Great Reckoning, perhaps?
As Jan has hinted, the Great Reckoning is the label that I've used for some time about the historical era in which human societies globally are living, indeed have been living since the middle of the 20th century. It's a reckoning in which human societies are having to come face to face with fundamental choices about how we live together globally. And in a sense, the short version of it is the global we simply a community of fate? We're living together, happen to be living together on this lonely planet. We're a community of fate, essentially. Or can we become a community of values that is a community with shared inclusive values, not shared nasty values, but shared progressive values. Cosmopolitanism is a word that I would use to describe that. My claim is that this period of history, or at least my original claim, was that this period of history, this era of history, will come to be seen as significant as the end of the feudal period or the arrival and development of the sovereign state system. And actually, in more recent times, I've come to think that actually this is the greatest of all great reckonings, because this period of history brings together the local and the global in ways which have never been before in history. So there are two aspects to this era. There's a gradual sense, as Jan was hinting at, there's a gradual sense that the ideas that made us, that made human society what it is today, or what it has actually become, the ideas that made us don't work anymore. A gradual questioning of, and we go back more than 500 years, we go back 4,000 years of patriarchy, proselytizing religions, that is, religions seeking to imperialize the religious map of the world. We have nationalism, sovereignty, consumer individualism, capitalism that doesn't count the cost of the environment, and so on and so forth. The ideas that made, if you put all those things in a bowl and stir them up, and then you get and look through 4,000 years of history, you get a world something like it is today. They're the structures of ideas that shape the institutions and very much our behavior. So that's one side of it, the ideas that make us not work being challenged. And then the other side of it is the increasing awareness of the global. So we're in human societies globally are more aware, have become more aware of the global challenges and not just the local challenges. And I divide these global challenges into two sorts. The first I call existential threats, and the second I call emancipatory threats. The existential threats are three. One is nuclear weapons and the risk of nuclear war. The second is climate chaos and environmental unsustainability. Put those in the same the natural world, that is, or what we call the natural world. And thirdly, pandemics. And emancipatory threats are challenges to the shorthand I use for emancipation is from a 19th century British radical thinker, Carpenter, and he wrote a book called Bread, Knowledge and Freedom. So for me, those three things, those three words, symbolize what emancipation is all about: bread, knowledge and freedom. And my argument would be that oppression anywhere that denies people of bread, knowledge and freedom, oppression anywhere calls into question human rights, and the opportunities for creating the conditions of emancipation everywhere are under challenge. The Great Reckoning, as I've talked about it over the years, has had a particularly significant period. And I dated this originally, and I'll stick by it, from the 9/11 attacks on the United States. And I call this period, obviously borrowing from E.H. I called it the new 20 years crisis. So it began with the 9/11 attacks, and the 20 years crisis comes to an end around now. 2020, 2021 is proving to be the time of COVID. And so the crises that we're here to talk about this afternoon fits very neatly, both in my idea of the Great Reckoning and this particularly intense period, which I called the which I call the new 20 years crisis. The spread I also talked about in this phase. I wasn't predicting, but I was extrapolating trends I could see in the first few years of this century. I was extrapolating, and Jan hates analogies, but I was extrapolating that time to the 1930s. And I was extrapolating that we were coming into a time of fascism, nationalism, populism, right-wing authoritarianism. Not the playing out of a Mussolini and a Hitler, but a real sense of a sort of technical definition of fascism as right-wing authoritarianism added to a very big dose of nationalism. And there's never been a better exemplar of that extrapolation, the wisdom of that extrapolation, than an American president inciting a mob on the 6th of January to march on the center of US democracy. So it seems to me, in answer to Jan's question, the pandemic fits very nicely into the new 20 years crisis, which fits very nicely into the idea of a great reckoning in terms of how we're globally to live together.
To summarize, are you saying this is the final act of the Great Reckoning?
No. I dated it sort of broadened. The Great Reckoning, I think, started in 1945 with the atomic bomb, when we had a view of the global that we'd not really had before. That is, that no state could ultimately defend itself. All were, the John Hertz and Brodie and all the rest of it. So that was a very significant development in human history. The bomb will always get through. And I'm seeing the crunch period is, say, the 10 or 15 years before 2045, when our lack of cooperation over climate chaos will come to roost.
Well, I can promise the listeners that it's only going to get more positive from now on. Richard's written quite extensively on the notions of state responsibility and global challenges, chiefly with regards to or with a view towards the climate challenge. I think best way to describe what he's been trying to perform the last few years, at least that I've had a chance to observe and read his writings, is that he's trying to do the impossible, and that is to sort of overcome the gap between global and national interests, holding on to the notion of state responsibilities. So, Richard, are you going to briefly reflect on COVID, the current crisis, and what you've been writing about, please?
Yes, thank you, Jan. I mean, just on that last skeptical point by you about closing the gap, I'm very aware of what Ken said earlier, and I think I'm very sensitive to that point, that at no point in history has there been such a experiential space in which local and global phenomena and processes are experienced together, or indeed are the same thing. And I think there is the key to the possibility of closing a gap. And I do think climate change and sustainability practices will be one way forward to close that gap, both in terms of politics and policy in the next 10 to 30 years. But as Ken said, quite clearly there's got to be the political will, and that political will has got to accelerate fairly quickly. I'm sure we'll talk about that later in terms of world order and questions of interdependence. So very quickly in relation to my concerns, yes, the desire to align. I think really after the failures of international liberalism at the end of the Cold War, the foolish celebration of international liberalism that quite a lot of liberals got into, particularly in America. The idea of an end of history, all those things we know very well. So they don't need to be rehearsed again. But I think in relation to that, my concern was, although I think I underestimated populism myself, others didn't, the need to align national development, and particularly with questions of equality, poverty, and social justice, national development with international development, indeed now planetary development. I think we're just at the beginning of that phase of thinking, which is, to use Ken's terms, a reorganization of human societies, but also a reorganization of the relationship between society and nature. I think COVID precisely has opened a space whereby that reflection and political action in relation to that reflection can take place. And in that sense, for me, COVID really does accentuate the successes and failures of state responsibility in their ability or not, and I'm thinking particularly here of vaccine nationalism, their ability or not to align global imperatives with national imperatives.
Excellent. So problems, but perhaps a little bit more of a perspective where Ken ended in terms of what could be done. Sanne and Benoit, would you like to say a little bit more without perhaps giving away everything in your excellent piece, which I think is one of the few pieces that I've read that actually makes a case that there is an opportunity in the crisis. So the old adage that no crisis should go to waste, to use the Rumsfeldism. Would you perhaps say a little bit more about the opportunities and possibilities as you see them that COVID may have opened up?
Sure. Thanks, Jan, and thank you for having us both. On that piece, which I'm glad you really liked, I'm going to let actually Sanne speak to it, because I wanted to say two things that are actually not related to the piece. So, Sanne, if you don't mind, kind of.
Okay, so paper, we kind of take one aspect of the current COVID crisis, namely the unprecedented by state, like they severely restrict freedom of movement, even in democracies. There was a move, at least initially, beyond austerity politics, there was a shutting down of large swaths of the industry, even industries that were incredibly powerful, like the airlines industry. And so despite that these actions were imperfect and across the globe, it did show an unacceptable form of agency power. It showed the ability of states and to overcome adversarial forces and structural obstacles. So hence, the core insight of our paper is that scholars have shown in the past that there's an ability of crisis to rearrange the current political landscape. But what we show is that the current crisis also sheds light on the past. It sheds light on the failure of policymakers, notwithstanding the fact that they promised to take action in critical domains such as climate change and disarmament, where we face existential problems. They actually didn't do anything. So our paper is examining what these policymakers have promised, what they've done instead, which is they mobilized tropes of impossibility, both citing structural obstacles or adversarial forces, and how those observations made us question politicians' good faith for actually living up promises that they made to their populations. So this is the first part of the paper in which we examine how climate politics, change politics, and disarmament politics have worked out. And yeah, I'll throw it back to Benoit here.
Right. From then on, really the insight is to go back to actually a concept that Professor Booth elaborated or hinted at in places, which is the concept of panglossism. And so we're essentially saying that the responses to COVID are an opportunity to recast political possibilities in claims of good faith. And we essentially document that most of the scholarship is committing what we call a Panglossian double failure, which is that the so-called problem-solving or self-portrayed problem-solving scholarship becomes problem-perpetuating because it doesn't allow itself to question the good faith of policymakers, even when we have a few instances of examples in the paper which are amusing, if not very sad, in which on the nuclear disarmament front, you have policymakers who say, yeah, actually the promise to disarm was a lie and it was a strategic lie. And then we document the instances in which scholars come at their rescue and say, no, they didn't really mean that. They didn't lie. Of course not. How would they? So you have this first problem of mischaracterizing good faith and turning then problem-solving scholarship into problem-perpetuating scholarship. But you essentially have a second failure, which is a form of self-censorship that produces by default a narrowing down of political possibilities. And so that's another topic I keep writing on, the boundaries of imaginability of possible futures. And in that particular paper, we document how scholarship was Panglossian, has been Panglossian in both fields. In being Panglossian, it doesn't document adequately the missed opportunities and essentially treats everything that hasn't been done as something that was impossible in the first place. So the point of the paper really is to offer insights for scholarship to move beyond this Panglossian double failure. I mean, the obvious methodological tool is counterfactual analysis, but there is more, and I'm going to bounce it back to Sanne on this one.
Okay, so going through kind of the prescriptions we make to resolve the Panglossian double failure in IR. Three recommendations. So the first one is scoping political possibilities. So we need to acknowledge the unknowability of the scope of possibility, which requires that we understand or that we take into account the possible ends of our society in the scope of what we study. We also want to introduce, and I think Benoit's broader work has talked a lot about this, introduce introduced of vulnerability as an organizing descriptor of the current global condition. And then we use, as Benoit said, counterfactual methodology to avoid the illusion of impossibility that is so persuasive in both our society and our scholarship. And then as a fourth point, we want to imagine futures in our understanding of the produced world's ability, of the produced possible worlds. And in the second instance, we're also trying to adjudicate, we want to encourage scholarship to adjudicate a debate between malevolence, failure of imagination as causes of inaction. So we're building on a bunch of literature here to kind of try to adjudicate this debate. And then in the third instance, we have some recommendations to create policy relevant scholarship 2.0, so to say, and scholarship that avoids the Panglossian double failure. More specifically, we advocate that broader citizenship should be taken as part of the audience that IR speaks to and that policymakers need to take in order to live up to our representative democratic values. The second is that we hope scholars want to be open about the normative, there's current normative stances as non-scientific, and we want to overcome the way our field thinks about normativity. And then finally, in terms of temporal, we also want to move beyond the presentism of our field and introduce notion temporality, for example, through the construct of timescapes. So this is paper, so it kind of basically has two parts of it. One is the observations about policy behavior in these existential crises, and the second one is how we as scholars can help policymakers in achieving a better world for us, I guess.
That's great. Thanks very much, everyone, for these introductions. All of you talk about possibility and action. All of you are students of international politics, and it seems to me in international politics, to get something done often requires large moving forces, typically known as the great powers. The great and the bad, or perhaps the great and the good, as some would like to know them. I'm somewhat skeptical about the good, but certainly the great. And I wonder whether one hears quite a bit about the shifts in the balance of power that COVID's going to induce, or has perhaps already induced. We've seen emphasis on great power politics competition even before this, and perhaps the current crisis might exaggerate that. I would like to hear your take on this dimension of the crisis. In other words, is there a great power transition underway? Does COVID crisis perhaps accelerate this? And how does that then affect the possibility of change in the directions that you would like to see?
I don't see COVID causing any systemic shifts or any significant changes in the so-called balance of power. And that is because I don't think the COVID crisis is, in global terms, a big enough crisis to cause any major shifts in behavior. For me, the COVID crisis is not global, or in some senses, it's not really national. It's family-sized tragedies. And family-sized tragedies, I don't think, are going to cause global shifts in the balance of power. And in this respect, I've been recalling a few times in recent months something that Kenneth Waltz wrote called The Continuity of International Politics, just after the 9/11 attack on the US. And he described the anti-terrorist coalition that was built up to cooperate against terrorism after that event. He called it a mile wide, the coalition that is, a mile wide and an inch thick. In a sense, what he was saying was that as far as the impact of 9/11 on the global situation was concerned, it was a couple of kilometers wide and it was a couple of centimeters thick. It wasn't a major global crisis in the sense of system change, for example. And I'd say the same about the pandemic crisis. It's difficult, I think, to foresee any fundamental changes as a result of the COVID crisis. You can see ripples. It'll help us perhaps see some things a little bit more clearly. It may just exacerbate some trends, but I don't see it in any sense of as a system changer. And if you want the briefest comments about the good or bad global players in the game, thinking of a few years ahead, 5 years or so, America's going to be tied up with overcoming the Trump years. It'll be at the best back to Obama, sort of constructive multilateralism, but great concern about what's happening in the United States. China's going to continue its policies of neocolonialism, and there'll be a response to that as increasing numbers of peoples see what China's up to and not help China in its cause. Russia's not really a major player in all this. It's got the 11th economy in the world. It's just ahead of South Korea. South Korea is not going to do anything to change the systemic picture. So why should Russia, which in many ways is a less effective society than South Korea? Russia will remain an unpleasant neighbor for many peoples, but it's not going to be a major player in the world. It's going to have its own internal problems as well, as we see. The EU is going to be tied up with its own problems. It's going to be coping with having lost one of the major players, the first member to lose. It's been performing pretty badly recently. It needs a restart. There's not much sign of it ever becoming an international actor. The interests of its members seem to dominate. So I think it's pretty much no fundamental shifts, a bit more clarity. The story of the years ahead in balance of power terms is going to be the rivalry of the United States and China.
Richard.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Ken's put it very well. I mean, it's clear that prior to COVID, we were entering a bipolar phase. I mean, if bipolar is the right word. Between the US and China, COVID hasn't changed that. It's actually accelerated it in some ways. But I think COVID's actually revealed some interesting things. There's no system change. I actually happen to think the events between November the 3rd and January the 6th are more important than, in some ways, all the events within COVID. To talk about, changes like 9/11, 2008. So I appreciate Ken's earlier points about marching on the Capitol. I do think that COVID has revealed that China is very bad at soft power. On the one hand, trying to supply Europe, obviously remember Italy, with supplies, be they protection supplies or respiratory machines, scoping devices, all the while, with its enormous abuse of human rights. It's in a ideological contestatory space that it cannot resolve, or at least one party system cannot resolve. And I think, basically COVID has been very revealing of that. Whatever the origins of, whether it's Chinese flu or not, or, is fairly irrelevant. I think also it's actually revealed with the bounce back, not sure I totally agree with Ken around the US, but I think what Biden has done since coming to power on January the 20th around the use of the federal government to reorganize the ways in which COVID are dealt with in the US. Obviously, there was a lot of money put into the system already under the Trump administration, but quite clearly the competence of government has come back in a way which I think has been much quicker than people thought was possible. And so COVID in some ways, just as it's revealed the inability of China to wield soft power, I think it's also showed us in some ways, but maybe I'm being too optimistic, that the US power within this bipolar structure, US power is absolutely enormous. And it's not just economic and military. It can regain political legitimacy fairly quickly. And in that sense, although the undermining of US global leadership was very clear in the last 4 years, I do actually think, but again, maybe my thought is more a hope, and in that sense, going back to Sanne, more normative in that sense. I think it shows the ability of the US to return to a power, but in a new environment where it cannot wield power in the way it did in the last 30 years. So COVID is not a game changer. It's certainly not systemic change, precisely because the microbiological revolution has ended, I think, the importance of pandemics for world politics, unlike in previous centuries, obviously. But it reveals some very interesting things about how power is going to be wielded within what is ultimately going to be, a structure of rivalry, competition, and collaboration between two superpowers.
Can I jump in now?
Yeah, please, Benoit, go ahead.
Listening to the other panelists, I think 3 observations came to mind. The first observation is going to be sector specific, that is nuclear weapons specific. And so the first observation, to go on with the point about continuity in spite of COVID, so we're in a phase in which the United States and Russia still possess over 90% of nuclear weapons in the world, and they, alongside all the other nuclear armed states, are in a phase in which they are planning to modernize and perpetualize their weapon systems for essentially 50 to 70 years. Those are plans, but those plans are in motion. For example, the modernization of the US triad, which was originally decided under Obama, and then essentially validated by Donald Trump with only a few cosmetic changes, that hasn't been disrupted at all by COVID. The plans of modernization haven't been disrupted at all by COVID. In my dear country, France, has a ministry of the armies that just made a speech in which she says, we are proud to announce that the next generation of submarines are being started to be constructed and they will sail until 2090. And she insisted on the fact that the last crew that would sail on those submarines was not even born yet. So what I'm saying is the imaginary of the state projecting itself into the future, in the imaginary of the industry, as well as the material requirements of the industry to perpetuate its cycles, they haven't been affected at all. Let's see whether that continues on. That's a first observation. Then the other one, which kind of contradicts myself entirely, would be to say, Sanne was kind enough to remind you that I'm a bit of a vulnerability-centric scholar. So I'm trying to recast nuclear weapons politics in terms of like, okay, everyone much smarter than me has talked about material vulnerabilities associated with nuclear weapons. Great. Then what I'm trying to do is say there is an epistemic dimension of this vulnerability, and that is, there is a gap between the confidence we give to the validity of our knowledge about our nuclear predicament and the evidence that we have to back it up. So we have a desire to believe in the sustainability of this universe. We have a desire to believe in the authorities that say that perfect, control is possible. And so we're actually documenting this gap. All I'm saying here with a second observation is that even we today, when we say things will continue, we have what I've diagnosed as a survivability bias. We forget that if nuclear war breaks out like tomorrow morning because of a little border fight between India and Pakistan and there is a nuclear winter, within half a day, like 1 billion people will die. So a nuclear winter will be produced, which will produce 1 billion casualties out of starvation over a decade. And so that's really something that we need to keep in mind. And that it really takes us back to Professor Booth's opening remark, which is like the one thing that nuclear weapons did is to end the possibility of protecting the populations. So of course we should think long term, and we should think about how these distant futures are conceptualized, because those imagined futures then shape what we allow ourselves to do. But we still need to factor in that we only need one nuclear war to essentially make all of our plans ridicule. And the third observation on what COVID kind of does in terms of great power rivalry, in the slides we wanted to show you, it's a cartoonist who in April 2020 drew, you probably all saw this, drew a little cartoon with two people on a very, very small island. And there is a massive wave that's coming towards the island and that says COVID-19 on it. And then one of the villagers says, just wash your hands and all will be fine. But the problem is, behind the wave that says COVID-19, there is a second wave much bigger that they don't talk about called economic recession. Behind the wave that's called economic recession, there is a third wave much bigger, which is called climate change disasters. And even behind this one, there is yet another one called biodiversity collapse. And to me, that is also substantiating what Professor Booth was describing in terms of the Great Reckoning. Like the COVID crisis is the one that affects our daily routines. But the issue of like the sustainability of the biosphere in terms of planetary boundaries, most of which have been crossed already, that's an ongoing process. So what I'm saying is we're ultimately talking about different temporalities. So we have the temporality of the industrial cycle and the fact that it sees continuity. We have the temporality of nuclear war, which is essentially a moment, which supposedly, again, I'm citing Professor Booth again, but here I'm going to disagree with him because I think his best book is the other one. It's Strategy and Ethnocentrism, and it's the one in which you say that, nuclear war is the possibility that ends all the others. So we have another temporality, and then the third temporality is essentially the intricacy of the crises of the biosphere.
One of the I'm long retired, but I do still do some lecturing. And one of my favorite bits of a lecture to the first years is taking up Marx's statement that all that's solid melts into air. And I ask them to think about what that is solid in their lives might melt into air by the time they reach my age. And I give them the examples of when I was born, the British Empire was still looking reasonably solid and ruled supposedly over 25% of the population of the world. By the time I was a student, it had pretty much gone. But by the time I was a student, the future was the Soviet Union. And by the time I was middle-aged, the Soviet Union had gone. So, and, by the time I finished talking, the United Kingdom, which was going to last forever, may well have gone. So we need to keep in mind all that solid melts into air in terms of the existence of states and hegemonies and so on. Was it Voltaire who said about if if the mighty Rome can fall, what can't? And we got to think about the United States and the Soviet Union in this sense. Sorry, the United States and China in this sense. Will the United States survive as a union? You know, there's potentially a breakup there into 3 or 4 countries at least. And what about China? It's got all sorts of internal problems. So we can't assume that tomorrow will be like today in that respect. And in the most important respect is what Benoit was talking about, that I try and remind students about nuclear weapons. And because students aren't interested on the whole in nuclear weapons, only a few seem to be, and the public as a whole, it's not anything that most ever think about. And the example I give in this respect, nuclear winter-wise, is and talking about climate chaos. You know, the liberal cliche these days is the greatest threat we face is climate change. Well, I tell them it depends what you mean by greatest, but there's only one change that can destroy civilization in the time it'll take before I finish this lecture, thinking I've got 25 or 30 minutes left, is a nuclear war. So I think we've got to sort of hammer the vulnerability issue and the changeability, thinking about broad historical spans very much more than we do. And we ought to think about, in a sense, very negative imaginaries, as well as what some of us might think are very positive imaginaries. What was the term you used? The boundaries of possibility in relation to things like world government. We need to think about those things a little bit more than we do, and not assume that tomorrow will be like today in any way.
Sanne, would you like to come in on any of this?
Yeah.
But please do if you wish.
Okay, I don't know if they're helpful points, but three thoughts that came to mind. One is the power of analogies. Like, I'm just thinking about the climate chaos. I mean, I think we saw like a teeny tiny fraction of that when we saw people in the immediate lockdown scramming to the grocery store and buying a lot of stuff and like realizing that actually things we took for granted for a moment there really weren't. So I think there's a power in that. So that's one point. But then there's the other point that, like, building on an earlier point about being hopeful, or the hope that the symbolic power of the US being restored relatively quickly in the wake of Biden becoming president is also very dangerous, because there are some structural changes that need to happen, and unless Biden actually engages upon those structural changes, we will quickly find ourselves in a really, really bad scenario. So I think that's the second bit. Yeah, I'll hold it there. Sorry.
If I can, I mean, still on this subject, I'm actually quite amazed by your relaxed attitude. It doesn't happen to me very often that I'm the alarmist in the room. But it seems to me that if one thinks about big systemic transitions in international politics, they've almost always been accompanied and could probably be traced to major economic crises and shift in wealth. Now, clearly, some of this has been going on for a while now, but do you not see that the COVID crisis has actually accentuated the wealth transition, and therefore with it a great power transition on the scale that we've seen in the past? So be it the Soviet Union going out of business because it simply can't afford to pay anymore for the Cold War competition, or the British Empire going out of business because it is no longer sustainable, and similar transitions in the past that have been tied to major economic shocks. I mean, in Britain, the budget, and this is a British centricism, so to speak, but the budget has been revealed. We will be taxed more than we've been in a long time, in many decades. The public debt has reached levels that have not been seen, and public borrowing has reached levels that we've not seen since the Second World War. This does not come on top of a decades of plenty in some ways, at least certainly not in terms of public finances and all that. In most countries, I mean, the Western countries for sure have been living on a credit card for, well, basically ever since the 1990s, roughly, or early 2000s. So do you not see that there is any significant potential for a change here?
But surely, can I just come in there, Jan? I'd like to take up again later the question of American leadership. I think Sanne's pointing to an important question there around hope and so forth, which we need to come back to. But I mean, the nature of this economic crisis, it's not a crisis in supply, it's a crisis in demand, and therefore recovery in terms of demand could come back pretty fast. I mean, that seems to be a fairly stable predictor of the fact, therefore, that, you know, various international organizations are suggesting that there'll be 4% growth next year. I mean, that is a very quick rebound. Now, how that rebound is organized, because of course it can accentuate both internal inequalities and, most importantly, I think, further inequalities between developed countries, and I include there the major developing countries and the lesser developed countries, particularly in Africa and Central Asia. That is huge. I mean, the implications of COVID for the least developed countries is enormous, and I mean, we're not addressing that here. It's rolling back sustainable development in really important ways, and that whole agenda. But I do think that you know, given the fact that this is a crisis of demand, that can be reorganized fairly quickly. Yes, the debt will have to be managed, but then we have to see, and this may be vulnerability, going back to Benoit and Ken, then we'll have to see interest rates change very fast to see how quickly that debt does lead to a new round of austerity, or whether the transition to a clean energy economy, which is obviously the agenda for the next 10, 20 years, that basically what COVID prepares is the ability for states to organize that transition in a way that neoliberal market fundamentalism refused up to this date. So I do believe it's a major change, a major moment of transition, of which COVID is a harbinger rather than itself the system changer. But I wouldn't be as alarmist as you are, Jan, given the fundamentals. But I'm very willing to be corrected if you think there is a more appropriate economic analysis.
Well, I'm not saying I wish to be an alarmist here. And in fact, at least you and Ken have heard me say that I think COVID is the beginning of the end of China's century. So in most ways, I share your views. I do believe that the economic dimension of the crisis tends to be written off exactly in the way you've just said. It's a crisis of demand. And I'm not entirely sure that that's exactly how it's going to play out. And we've seen unexpected economic crises, protracted economic crises lead to system-changing moment, and few would have predicted that. So in the 80s, we had confidence in the Soviet Union staying in the Cold War because it was on the way of internal reform, so it could pay for this, and actually it brought a collapse. And so I'm just trying to bring in that perspective, not to say that it will necessarily highlight a power transition, but more to probe you and say what do you think of that? And you obviously, the answer that you're putting forward, Richard, is a plausible one. I think if I were to sound an alarmist tune here, I think slightly self-satisfactory on the Western part. But there we are.
In that respect, I think I think maybe Richard hinted at it earlier. The problem is not, in a sense, liberalism. The problem is liberals, and the people who are writing about the problems of climate change and so on and so forth are intellectuals, comfortable people like us, I assume. But when were we last at a political demonstration? When were we last doing the work that is needed to do to make democracy work? Trump could turn out lots of supporters and very enthusiastically so, but John Eikenberry can't. The problem is that the liberal, it's we liberals who are too comfortable. It's the great book from about 1990 by Galbraith about the culture of contentment. We get somebody else to go and struggle in the streets, and I'm just amazed at the moment about what's going on in the streets in Myanmar and indeed in many parts of Russia, the people, the risks they're taking. But, you'd be hard-pressed to get 5 academics in the UK to turn out and go into an anti-nuclear demonstration, for example.
Yes, but I mean, is that not actually reinforcing the point of a transition? I mean, we've seen what has been happening largely unchallenged in a number of places in the world. I mean, the announcement, and I don't want to be too present this, but this has been going on for a long while. What China's doing in Hong Kong is an obvious tightening of the screws. And I dare say that but for the COVID crisis, we would not have seen this. Now, you may say, quite rightly, that this was bound to always happen because that's what great powers do, and they will assert themselves in their regional settings. And I'm actually on board with that argument. But we've seen it in other places, and simply the capacity of countries like the United States, European countries, Britain among them, and so on and so forth, will be absorbed by having to pull out of the current crisis, which simply will have, I think, effects globally. To expect otherwise seems to me implausible.
So I'm going to relieve you, Jan, from the burden of being the alarmist. I just wanted to essentially bring back the sense that, what strikes me within the little field of IR that we all write in, there is this concern about power transition from one state to the other, so the US and then China, is there going to be a war or whatnot? But I keep wondering, okay, is anyone going to care at any point about the fact that there is this the thing that Niall Ferguson called Chimerica, the fact that China and the US are massive producers, CO2 emitters, so that as producing entities, they produce a fast degradation of the biosphere, together. And so then there is a question, if we're talking about political reorganization of the world, to me, the question is, how do we identify the destroyers of world that we want to disrupt, contain, or roll back against? But if we're in a world in which nuclear war remains possible and essentially destruction of life through biodiversity collapse is not just possible but is ongoing, I really think that we need to step back and think about what are the entities that we should label as or the processes that we should label as this is what we should stop first. And that gets us back to what Professor Booth was saying about, who's in the street, but also who's in the street against what. It's very striking to me that the Extinction Rebellion movement, for all its good and bad, has nothing to say about the nuclear weapons problem. It's an Extinction Rebellion that lives in a nuclear weapon-free world. So, just as a reminder, right, there are still 30,000 nuclear weapons in the world today. Just wanted to say that.
And can I come back on what Benoit's just said? Yeah. I mean, one, I'm certainly not. I'm not for Western self-satisfaction, not at all. But I do believe it's important to underscore the remaining and extraordinary economic and military importance of the United States. And I think during the Common Era, the kinds of financial flows that the US facilitated, despite Trump's rhetoric, was incredibly important. So that's one thing. So I think this question of being vulnerable, not being complacent, indeed advocating humility in the kind of world that we want, is really important with regard to these threats. Nevertheless, with regard to Benoit, I would say I think we have to disaggregate these existential threats because we've seen that we can't comprehensively approach them. So I would separate the existential threat of climate change, which is not an existential threat for everybody, and therefore I think is loaded. It's an existential threat for low-lying islands and deltas, not for northern countries, for example. So I found Extinction Rebellion complacent in its use of the term. But I think, just to address you, Benoit, and to look at this, which is, as Jan knows, and I'll look at it with the cup half full, not half empty, because otherwise I don't understand what we're doing as scholars. I think it's really important to be pessimistic, but I think it's also very important to be optimistic. With regard to climate change, 54% of global emissions, redound to China and the United States. Therefore, they're incredibly important together in mitigating climate change emissions in the next 10, 20 years. I mean, that's precisely the point. So the very fact that these are the two greatest emitters, the very fact that they could coordinate between Jinping and Obama the Paris Agreement, because the Paris Agreement was not possible without those two powers, means that when Biden says, and did, literally the day after coming to power on January the 20th, I return to the UNFCCC process and therefore will be present at COP26. This is incredibly important with regard to any understanding of global collective action, which I do think we need to promote whilst tracing the dilemmas. So I want to try and emphasize where lines of action can take place in the coming years. And for that reason, I think it is important to disaggregate the politics and the policy, or the policy and the politics. And I think it's very important to emphasize where China and the US are going to be absolutely critical for certain global threats to be addressed in the coming decades.
Jan?
Yes, Ken, go ahead.
Can I relieve you of the burden of being the alarmist and just briefly mention something that I think is truly alarming, and it is directly related to COVID-19. First of all, this is a private joke between Jan and myself, but I'll surprise you by saying that I bought the Financial Times on Saturday, and there was an article by Yuval Noah Harari about the COVID year, and he made me think about one vulnerability that I hadn't particularly thought about. One of the things we've learned from what he called the COVID year is how successful humans are against disease. And he made the point that in previous centuries, Spanish flu was one of the things he mentioned, in previous centuries, if a pandemic had occurred, Lots of us died. In doing the things that we had to do to try and defend against it, we only spread it even further. So the numbers of people dying went up and the economic consequences went up as well. And the reason we were able to live through the lockdown without a major economic downturn and without major changes to our lives, one of the things was working at home for many people. So it's pretty much business as usual for lots of lucky people like us. Supermarkets could be filled because lots of trucks could take lots of stuff around and it only needed a few people. So the economy could work in lots of different ways without many humans being involved. And then we've got these brilliant scientists who can get on and doing it. So in one sense, the internet, the digital world, made us somewhat protected, invulnerable against pathogens, perhaps for the rest of history. But what does it all depend upon? It depends upon the internet and the digital world. So in that sense, I suddenly became much more scared about cyber insecurity than I've ever been before, because anybody who wanted to do anything nasty against the industrialized countries, for example, or the world in general, just needs to be very good at disrupting the internet. And that's something I think we should feel really vulnerable about and be really scared about.
Jumping in with a couple of thoughts. So first, I mean, I think again, you're onto something with the internet and with how it has kept us connected and how it's also a source of major vulnerability. But along the same lines, I mean, as we all well know, COVID showed the deep inequality. We can sit behind our desk at home. Somebody else is going to have to go get our groceries, going to sit in the cashier the whole time. And I think the larger problem with COVID in our society is that after this is somewhat mitigated, form it may be that we're all vaccinated or that the virus becomes lethal or whatever it is, everything is going to want to go back to the status quo as quickly as possible. Like the fact that, and the status quo is not enough. Biden re-entering the UNFCCC is enough because the UNFCCC is not going to lead us to the solutions to climate change. International cooperation is important, but it's not enough because we're going too slow. We're going too incremental. And I think we need to identify opportunities beyond the current structures. So like basically a call for unilateral action. There's a call for states and local levels to actually do something about climate change, about changing its dynamics, which announcing, I think, a couple of months ago that they were going to address climate change. I think those, I think as scholars, what we ought to do in this is we need to find these, we not only need to identify the problems and analyze them correctly and point out where there is wrong, where politicians and policymakers were wrong, but we also need beyond what I think is the current framework in IR and the focus on international cooperation and identify all possible ways of changing something whilst taking into account, I think, a lot of what the deep inequality on a national, on a global and a local level that is constantly coming to the forefront, and did again with COVID-19 in order to create sustainable solutions as well. Sorry.
That sounds all great. Go ahead, Benoit. Sorry.
No, I just wanted to go back to maybe to Richard's point on sort of the duty to be optimistic, because otherwise, what are we doing here? So my take would be that this is a two-track strategy, that we need to do our best, right, to improve circumstances and to pursue particular policy goals. Those are, I mean, this is the first element that I was thinking about. Identifying escapisms, pointing them out, and not doing them is crucial. And in that respect, I think the one person who would have been a great addition to this lineup would have been Dan Dudney. In that respect, I think his book, Dark Skies, documents brilliantly how essentially the dream of going into space and pretending that your salvation is going to be about colonizing the most hostile environment ever known to man, as a way of not looking at the fact that we're not even able to keep this Earth habitable is a great example of something that we should keep doing. So identifying escapisms and avoid them. But the other bit is, sure, let's work together to make a better future possible. But it strikes me that given that pretty dire extinction circumstances are possible, we need to also think about what would it mean to die in dignity, and go back to essentially, what the Greeks were thinking in terms of ars moriendi, and how do we avoid the essentially mentality that says I'm ready to do anything to survive if we get into a predicament in which that's what happens. I think our role is also to think, what if we fail? Then what kind of normative universe can we provide so that massive disasters do not lead to a race in which everyone is ready to do all sorts of unspeakable things to survive. That's something that occupies me more and more.
Yeah, and could just very quickly,
please?
Yeah, I don't think one has a duty, Benoit, to be optimistic. I mean, optimism cannot be an obligation. I absolutely fully agree with what you're saying. I mean, I was brought up to be critical and reflective. I just think at this particular historical conjuncture, it is important to emphasize where there is potential. And in a sense, what you and Sanne are talking about in terms of boundaries of political possibility is critically important. So the recasting political imagination is critical at this moment. All I wanted to stress, and I'm sorry if I'm coming over as unrigorous and boundlessly optimistic, because that is not what I want to say. I just want to suggest that there are potentials at the moment that need to be harnessed. And one of those, and I would just say with regard to the UNFCCC, of course, Sanne, you're right, it's not enough, but it's extremely important that it goes on anyway. And the lack of American leadership for the last 4 years has had important effects. It hasn't shifted world order, because the structures, as we talked about earlier, are in place and they are evolving around the pathways that were predicted. But the lack of American leadership in the last 4 years has been extremely telling and very important. And it shows the importance of contingent events in specific moments of years, that they are critical. And therefore, just as it's critical that Trump's lack of leadership was so telling, it's critical when there are leaders able to help structure reimagination around political possibility. And I do think the Biden plan, which is both international and domestic, it obviously depends on the Senate and so forth. We all know that. And we know that it is a crippled system for the moment. But I think there is a lot of potential within that. And that's what I'm trying to get to. And of course, with that comes always the risk that that potential is never realized. And one has to leave it as a counterfactual in history.
Perhaps this gives us a nice chance to transition to a lot of you said interesting things about cooperation and the need to cooperate. And I don't know, I think I better ride with the theme of being the pessimist in the room today then. As the current crisis not revealed exactly the problems of cooperation and the limits of it. Richard's already mentioned vaccine nationalism, and we clearly see attempts by countries to use not only to restrain exports and cooperation when it comes to vaccines deliveries, but also the other way around, to use vaccines as tools of essentially power diplomacy, to dangle in front of hapless people and basically bound them to some specific positions and take stands on specific international political questions. We've seen the closing off of countries on a scale that is quite unprecedented, even in Europe, but elsewhere too. We hear that this is probably going to stay for a while. We constantly have this notion of the threat coming from elsewhere. So once again, being at a risk of sounding British-centric, I mean, this government that believes that anybody coming from the dangerous countries needs to be quarantined in a hotel. Where are the sources of optimism on cooperation and international cooperation? I mean, international institutions have not been quite enhanced by this. We've seen it with regard to the WHO. One need not be as foolish as the Trump administration was with regard to it, but it's not to say that Chinese behavior towards WHO has been much better. It is not going to come out very well out of this crisis, as are perhaps not other international institutions. And if we're talking cooperation, we're not talking just international institutions, but we're certainly talking to some degree international institutions.
Can I respond?
Please, Ken.
Can I respond by a pedantic point and at a high level of generalization, probably? I'd like us to drop the words optimism and pessimism out of this discussion because they're completely inappropriate. Optimism and pessimism are temperamental urges or feelings. They've got nothing to do with scholarly positions. What I'd like us to do, instead of talking about optimism and pessimism, is to think about Kenneth Boulding's expression that if something exists, or if it existed, then it's possible. And then trail through history, as he did, and discovered that for most of the time humans are negotiating rather than engaging in violence. Think of the time when former enemies got together and behaved non-violently towards each other. Think of groups that developed helpful ways of behaving across borders, agreeing on all sorts and sorts of things. We know that religious groups in different times, in different places, have managed to live together in harmony, and so on and so forth. Different ethnic groups in different parts of the world have lived together harmlessly as well. So instead of being pessimism, let's look at history in a Boulding-esque way and say there are resources for rational hope here. So instead of being optimistic, believing that things are going to get better and, Pollyanna-ish about the future, things can get better in every way. We have got to really work at these things, but there is there is space for rational hope. And here, on realism, for example, I've really come in the last 10 years to like the work of Raymond Geuss, who, to me, explains thinking the impossible, explains it and puts it in a strong philosophical base. And basically, it's an argument that what might appear impossible in one generation doesn't mean it's impossible. It's just impossible in that generation or to those people who are thinking that way. And here I want to bring in a line allegedly from Lenin, though I've never been able to find it, but it doesn't matter who said it, I think it's right. And that is, there's nothing so radical as reality. And if you take a wide enough vision of human life through history, you can see the sense of Geuss's point about what was impossible in one era becomes possible in the next era. And you can think about that in huge long-term spaces through history. You know, the idea of democracy to a peasant in the 11th century, you know, have a chat to a peasant in feudal times and say, well, one day, lad, you'll be able to put an X in a box and you can vote for your leader and so on. And that would have seemed crazy to a peasant in the 11th century. In fact, the peasant would have said, what's an X? What's a ballot? And so on and so forth. So through time, things that were crazy become normal. And when you think of narrow periods, you can think that one of the examples I like to use here is Italy in 1945 was one of the defeated Axis powers. In 1949, it was a founder member of NATO. So there are times in history when things can change very quickly. So I think it's possible, and this is, you know, hopefully where I sit myself, neither an optimist nor a pessimist, but somebody who has rational hope that things can get better on the basis of things in history having been better, admittedly in small bits, not altogether, but the world is getting smaller.
If I rephrase it, when it comes to cooperation, which was a running theme, what are some of the sources of rational hope? I'm not sure I want to buy Kant's language on this, but be it as it may, where are the sources of cooperation given everything that we've seen that has happened? I suppose Richard might once again invoke the change in the United States, and that's a possibility, certainly. But where else?
I think, can I just come in there? I mean, fine around the term hope. I mean, I totally understand Ken's intervention around pessimism and optimism. It's picking up threads that allow for rational hope. That's fine as a framework. I think in terms of cooperation, I mean, where I'm very interested, obviously, and I've been referring to it several times, is around climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies at the moment. I do think it's very interesting what happened in the last 6 years or last 10 years. The Copenhagen summit, which was trying to, for example, I'm getting to your point, Jan, and I do think COVID's in part of this. The Copenhagen summit in 2009, which was looking for a post-Kyoto protocol, basically to bring together developing and developed worlds around climate mitigation, that collapsed because of the inability to allocate historical responsibility in terms of distributional capacity. China, India moved away, and the Western countries would not assume more their own responsibility with regard to Western industrialization. So that was a stalemate. But the Paris Agreement in 2015 was a success in terms of cooperation, but built not on an international treaty, which was just not possible. It was built from the ground up in terms of the reality, to use that term that Ken's referred to very strongly recently in his previous comments, the reality that we're in a state system, the reality that nation states are still very important despite claims of global governance, post-national sort of pathways, post-sovereigntist and all the rest, that no, nation states are the place where agency is still really important with regard to change. And the idea of nationally determined contributions, although they're not monitored yet, and there is no international institution to do that monitoring, and China refuses that monitoring. Nevertheless, the ratcheting up process of COP and the UNFCCC is really very interesting at this moment, because there is a dynamic taking place where all countries now, with very few exceptions, are precisely pledging. Okay, yes, they are pledges, and so we've got to get into what is rhetoric and what can become policy that is implemented. Making pledges towards a net zero society by 2050 is the normative average, and it's between 2040. And China has just declared that it wishes to achieve net zero before 2060. Now, this may be a model of collaboration and cooperation at this moment in time that is going to be the most effective, given the fact that international institutions have lost a lot of legitimacy. And as you said, it's going to be difficult to see them return to something like a post-1945 world order where they gain increasing authority and legitimacy. So I think maybe the way in which we are going to have to think in the next 10, 20 years, the very notion of cooperation has to change. And I'm wondering, I don't know, I'm wondering whether the kind of the Paris Agreement and the way that's working signals a way forward. And I think with that, I would say I do think the Sustainable Development Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals and their targets, and there are hundreds of targets, if that dovetails with that process, could create an alignment between national action and international action, which would take us to a new paradigm of international cooperation. That's a thread in Ken's terms, which I would like certainly to follow through in the coming years.
I think it does help. I do think it does help a little bit. And I agree very much with what Richard just said. I've been occasionally trying to plug the argument that security begins abroad. And I think that COVID helps in that, because one of the cliches that has come out about COVID is that none of us is safe till all of us are safe. And if we think a bit more about that in relation to climate change and nuclear weapons as well, think of, and it's not just come out of the blue. None of these things come out of the blue, but the idea of common security that was so powerful in the 1980s with Olof Palme and END and the rest, and the idea that we should be seeking security with others, not against others. And I think COVID has been helpful, more helpful than, as Benoit was sort of implying, that the nuclear threat is there, but it's not, people are not living it, they're not experiencing it. Though those of us who came to think about nuclear weapons very seriously at the height of the Cold War, we felt we were experiencing it, because when people asked us our views about would there be a nuclear war in our lifetime, most of us said yes, we did think there would be the case. But the idea of security with others, the idea of we won't be secure till everybody's secure. COVID has been helpful in what I would see as a slowly growing global consciousness, out of which I take some hope as far as in making the possibility of international institutions working better.
Benoit, did you want to come in?
Yeah, at the risk of being parochial, I'm going to go back to much more modestly than what the other panelists were saying, to what I think this sets as a task for us scholars, or a possible task. I'm not saying we should do that, right? But what COVID does in that respect, which is interesting, is it leads us to ask the connection between visibility and mobilization. And I'm not talking about the aesthetic turn in general in IR. I'm talking about this issue of, okay, the COVID thing is the invisible threat, literally. And so the question, when people are wondering about the coming and going of the disarmament movement, or in general of the level of concern about nuclear weapons, one of the common responses is, oh yeah, but during the Cold War, there was nuclear testing, so there was a lived experience, and there was also visibility of atmospheric testing that then later on went down. So obviously there was mobilization short of visibility, but I thought that's an interesting angle for us, because if we're talking about the nuclear realm, we have two challenges. We have the challenge best diagnosed by Gunther Anders, which is a challenge of imagination. Anders created this. So Gunther Anders, German philosopher, former husband of Hannah Arendt and student of Heidegger, crafted this notion of the Promethean discrepancy in the late 50s. And he says Hiroshima essentially creates a gap between human ability to destroy on the one hand, and on the other, humans' ability to imagine how much destruction they can produce and to morally relate to it. So we have this imaginal discrepancy that I argue in a recent piece can be filled with particular aesthetic gestures. But then we have this question of, do we need to see the problem to mobilize a global consciousness? And so this is early work. We're not there yet, but there is possible good news. I have to take all the pessimistic bit out now, even the word needs to go out, I heard, to say that essentially in the early years after Hiroshima, there is a really interesting moment before the images were out. So then the question is, globally, what's the interpretation of the meaning of those bombings before they become images? And so the question is, can mobilization precede images? And the good news is, yes, it can. Just thought of the issue of visibility and mobilization as a thread for possible cooperation. Maybe the other point. Sorry, I don't want to be too long, but the other point that is amusing if we want to look back at history and identify loci for change, is that a lot of the scholarship and the discussion assumes that only the progressive camp is shooting itself in the foot. In history, literally, there is an equal opportunity to shoot yourself in the foot, meaning also like conservative plots serve the progressive camp sometimes. The example that always comes to mind is essentially the process leading to the INF Treaty, which had a lot to do with the United States and Richard Pearl really opposing the possibility of arms control. And their strategy to make sure that arms control would not happen was to make very, very generous and ambitious arms control proposal so that the Soviets would refuse them and they would blame the failure of the proposal on the Soviets. But that only worked for a time, because when Soviet leadership changed, then Gorbachev picked up the US proposal, and this is how the process leading to the INF Treaty started. Why am I saying that now that the INF Treaty is gone? Precisely because there's something unprecedented in the INF Treaty. That's a bilateral treaty, therefore your question of cooperation. That's a bilateral treaty that for the first time doesn't just limit the arms race, but literally removes an entire category of weapons. And here, the making of that treaty has to do with the conservative camp, let's say, shooting itself in the foot.
So I think that's all great and good. And I'm tempted to buy the argument that the non-cooperative reactions are basically residues, and that the current crisis is something that can open us up to the realization that security begins at broad and that others need to be involved and all that. But that seems to me is articulated from a very particular position, sitting where we are. In other words, for the Chinese who lock up millions of people in cities and regions if they need to with an outbreak of COVID, the security does not begin abroad. It begins with repression at home, and so it does in other places. So I wonder whether this underlying type of thinking that might make for a thread of cooperation, for a thread of thinking and behavior that we would like, whether that's actually confined to specific places in the world. Whether that's basically an expression of some type of thinking that only happens in some places, in Europe, possibly in the United States, perhaps elsewhere. But if the crisis can be managed by other means, then perhaps international global solutions are not needed or are not believed to be needed.
Well,
Yeah,
look,
Jan,
you go on, Richard. I've spoken too much. Go on.
Well, I have as well. No, I just wanted to say, I mean, what you've just said there around security with regard to domestic, I mean, it would seem therefore that, the question, for example, which obviously a lot of people are now posing with the reality of Chinese power. So, for example, Hong Kong has already gone. Those kind of, that actually we are talking about new contestations of ideology and values, and I think that is it's very important that we are going to be in a world of competition, rivalry, and collaboration, where there will be a new, not a new Cold War, but a new way of thinking how to both contain and rival different interests and values. And there is nothing new in that, but obviously the circumstances are new. That for me is what you signal when you say, yes, there are very different security regimes in place and at issue at this moment in time. That would be my response to what you've just said, yeah.
My response is that it sounded like a desperate counsel of despair. Well, just because there's a big place called China and it does bad things is not a reason for much of the rest of the world to think about behaving in different ways.
So I'm not saying what you're saying I'm saying. No, but I do wonder whether if I make it very crude, whether we are witnessing two options here. One is you manage the current situations through greater extent of cooperation and commonality. And that's one model that's been put forward largely here, and that I think is a relatively contained view in our part of the world. And whether there is a essentially massively domestically repressive regime, I don't know if you want to call it fascism, that manages the situation fundamentally differently. And if it leads to an ideological competition that Richard has noted, which I think it would if that is the case, then obviously that changes international politics fundamentally. I'm not a counsel of despair here, as you put it, but I am asking what the implications of that are. Now, perhaps we could have a final go at this, and I realize it's a big issue, and I would not have reached it had you not all made excellent comments that you've had. But since we have about, say, 5 minutes, perhaps we could round up here and amongst ourselves mark this as a to be continued.
I mean, just in response to that, and then I'm finished. And thank you very much for the opportunity of this. It's been really interesting listening to everyone. I do think one of the issues coming up is development, both national and international development. And I think there is going to be a very big question about where China is placed within the UN institutions around sustainable development, given that its Belt and Road Initiative is increasingly becoming abusive to the most fundamental human rights. And I think there will be contestation because it has a major role on UN bodies. And those bodies will become, I think, increasingly important. Not to say the international institutions will necessarily have greater power and legitimacy, but the role of China within those institutions around development is going to be increasingly important. And I think there will be contestation, and I think it's bound to become ideological. And how that is negotiated diplomatically, less prudently, more prudently, I think is an important global challenge in the coming decades. And I think that's going to have to necessarily be aligned with other ways in which one negotiates with China. And as I say, I think the most important one will be climate change. And here, COVID has been a harbinger of both how not to behave towards China and how China itself should not particularly behave, but we've got no particular promises around that, obviously. And it's not our immediate concern. But I think what has happened during COVID in the relationship between China and the US is extremely interesting. And I think that will change in the coming years with the Biden administration, but with the proviso that, of course, everything could change again if the House changes color in 2022. So I think COVID, for me, is a harbinger of a very important relationship between the US and China, which is both with regard to those particular superpowers, but also with regard to questions in general of development.
Thanks, Richard. Anybody else? Sanne, Benoit, Ken?
I guess there are two options, but I don't see them quite in the same way as you do. One option is the Chinese way, is actually the Chinese way, and I recall a Chinese foreign ministry spokesman last year sometime more or less saying, like Mr. Khrushchev in the 1950s, about peaceful coexistence. You know, it's going to be an economic and ideological and whatever competition, but not a military one. So that's one way and one option, seeing it as bluntly as that. And the other one is to adopt a position of containment of China militarily, and otherwise some sort of détente, and see how it goes. That's what you can't mechanically fix it at this point.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Ken. Sanne?
So, I mean, I'm not by any means a China with marks here, but I think we want to be careful about how we talk about China and how we not to stereotype China, because I think there are also opportunities in China itself. Like when I was studying in China, it became very clear to me that there are concerns around food safety, around clean air, and a couple of other themes among the Chinese population. And they are willing to challenge their government over these issues. So I feel like there are ways to create commentaries across these rivalries that we don't set up those rivalry from impediments to actually see areas in which we can find common ground. So I want to just add in a word of caution, I guess, with regards to Chinese domestic politics.
That's a great point. Thank you, Sanne. Benoit?
So I'll just end very quickly by expressing appreciation for this conversation and just saying one thing about the fact that what we're faced with is normative alternatives. I think what COVID does for us is present us with the issue of whether the population will react to the possibility of repressive regimes supposedly performing better by saying, okay, then we are fine to essentially let go of particular freedoms for security, or whether they will say like, wait, no, we don't want to think in those terms, and we don't want to think in that alternative, or even to accept it. Of course, you expect me to fall back on the nuclear weapons issue. And I think on the nuclear weapons issue, we have a similar really trade-off with the entry into force of the Prohibition Treaty, because essentially what we have now as a divide is a set of countries which are nuclear armed and say, for the sake of our national survival, we have to, we must, and we are willing to threaten, to commit massive nuclear violence, and another set of countries that says, even for the sake of our survival, we are never prepared to commit massive nuclear violence. So I think essentially what we're facing is just a normative competitions between like kind of worldviews and normative competitions about how do you define what you're willing to sacrifice in order to survive.
That's great. Thank you very much, everybody, for all your points and comments and questions that you've raised. Thanks to the Center for inviting us to have this debate. And I'm sure this conversation is to be continued. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jan.
Thank you.